My family mocked me all through Easter dinner. Still broke? Need bus fare? The jokes flew faster than the dinner rolls. I just smiled, past the salt. Then the bank president walked in. He looked straight at me and said, "Good to see you. Major Shareholder." The room went silent. There are moments in life when an entire carefully constructed world can crumble, revealing a truth so shocking it changes everything. For me, it happened over a quiet Easter dinner, when a surprise visitor blew up my entire family's perception of who I was, and what I was truly capable of. I can still smell it, ham and sweet potatoes, thick in the air of my childhood home. But beneath that comfort, there was always Ryan. My brother's booming laughter, his endless tales of business triumph, they filled every corner. I just sat there, quiet at the kitchen island, peeling carrots for Mom's salad. I listened as he boasted about his new BMW, the fancy steakhouse where he'd taken his girlfriend, the $200 bottles of wine. Aunt Nancy would gasp on cue, Uncle Bob would nod with that familiar, almost reverent approval, the kind always reserved for Ryan. Then, his eyes would sweep across the room, landing on me, a familiar smirk playing on his lips. "Right, Lisa? I mean, you probably wouldn't know about places like that, but trust me, it's worth every penny." I kept my gaze on the carrots, each precise cut of the knife a silent act of defiance against the sting of his words. This was our Easter tradition, Ryan, in his flashy car, expensive clothes, reminding everyone of his success. And me? I was the cautionary tale, the daughter who'd chosen a simple life over ambition. Mom, bless her heart, would try to intervene. "Lisa's doing just fine. She's got her little apartment downtown, seems happy enough." Little apartment, the judgment hung in the air. I'd stopped correcting their assumptions years ago. Let them think what they wanted. Let them believe my modest Honda meant I was struggling, that my quiet dinners at home were born of necessity. The truth was locked away, not out of shame, but sheer exhaustion. I was tired of proving myself to people who had already decided who I was. "You know what Lisa's problem is?" Ryan's voice cut through my thoughts again. He never waited for an answer. "She's too scared to take risks. Always playing it safe. Always thinking small. That's why she's still renting that cramped place. While I'm looking at houses in Greenwood Estates." Greenwood Estates, a soulless development where every house looked the same, where success was measured by square footage. I'd driven through once, felt suffocated by the uniformity. "Risk-taking is important," Dad chimed in, settling into his recliner. "A man has to be willing to put himself out there, make bold moves. A man, not a person. Not his children. Just a man." I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life, usually with Ryan basking in the spotlight, and me, the invisible daughter, fading into the background. The one who'd chosen stability over spectacle, who'd somehow disappointed them by not crashing and burning dramatically enough to warrant their concern. I finished the carrots and moved to the living room. My cousin Amanda, sprawled on the couch, looked up. That familiar pity in her eyes. "So, Lisa," she purred, "are you still working at that same place, the insurance company?" I hadn't worked there in 3 years. But correcting Amanda would mean explanations, and questions I wasn't ready to answer. So, I just nodded, retreating to my designated corner chair. "That's nice," she continued, already back to her phone. "Job security and all that. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur like Ryan." Ryan preened, launching into another conquest. I let the words wash over me, focusing on the sunlight outside. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, reminding me why I'd loved this house as a child. Before success became the only measure of worth. Before every conversation turned into a comparison. Before I learned that being quietly content was, in their eyes, a failure. The thing is, I hadn't always been the family disappointment. High school, straight A's, full scholarship to state university, teachers praising my work ethic. But somewhere along the way, Ryan's flashier accomplishments, his sales awards, his company car, his loud confidence, they'd overshadowed my quiet competence. I'd retreated, stopped sharing my victories. It was easier to be overlooked than to constantly fight for recognition that felt increasingly hollow. "Anyway, Lisa probably couldn't even afford a weekend in the city," Ryan was saying now, his voice dripping with that casual cruelty he'd perfected. "I mean with rent and student loans and everything. It's tough out there for people without real career prospects." Student loans. If only he knew. I'd paid those off 2 years ago, along with the mortgage on the downtown building I'd quietly purchased through an LLC. But Ryan lived in a world where his assumptions were facts. Mom glanced at me, that mix of concern and resignation in her eyes. In her mind, I was the daughter who needed protecting, who'd had a harder life than her golden boy. Her sympathy stung worse than Ryan's mockery. "Easter's supposed to be about family," she finally said, her voice quieting Ryan. "Let's focus on being grateful for what we have." What we have? I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA but understood nothing about my actual life. Ryan, whose definition of success was entirely external. Mom and Dad, who'd convinced themselves their son's bragging was confidence, while their daughter's discretion was defeat. Amanda, measuring everyone by how their stories compared to her own. I'd spent years absorbing their judgments, letting their narrow definitions make me question myself. But something had shifted. Maybe turning 30, understanding their approval wasn't worth pretending to be someone I wasn't. Maybe realizing their version of family felt more like performance than connection. Or maybe it was the phone call I'd received 3 days ago, the one that had changed everything in ways they couldn't even imagine. I excused myself to help Mom in the kitchen, grateful for a moment away from Ryan's monologue. She was basting the ham, efficient and practiced. "You know, he doesn't mean anything by it," she said without looking up, as if reading my thoughts. "He's just excited about his success. You remember how he was when he made varsity football? Same energy." I remembered. Ryan always needed an audience, processed his worth through other people's reactions. Not malicious, exactly, but exhausting. "I know, Mom," I said, reaching for the dinner rolls. "I just wish," I paused, wondering how to finish that sentence. I wish they saw me as more than their cautionary tale. I wish success didn't have to be loud to be valid. I wished I could share my actual life with them without it feeling like I was trying to prove something. Nothing, I said finally. "The rolls smell amazing." She smiled, a tired smile. I wondered if she was as exhausted by these gatherings as I was. The doorbell rang just as we were setting the last dishes on the table. "Someone get that, will you?" Dad called. It wasn't the neighbors with Easter cookies. Through the front window, I saw a black sedan. Expensive, understated. The kind of car that whispered wealth. My stomach tightened. This wasn't part of the plan. Ryan, ever eager for a new audience, bounded to the door. His confident smile faltered when he saw the man on the porch. Mr. Harrison. Just as I remembered him, tall, silver-haired, impeccably tailored navy suit, quiet authority. His expression was warm, almost grandfatherly. "Good afternoon," he said, a hint of a southern accent. "I'm looking for Lisa Parker. I hope I'm not interrupting your family celebration." The room went silent. Even Amanda looked up. Ryan's mouth opened and closed, trying to process why someone so clearly important would be asking for his unremarkable sister. I stepped forward, my heart hammering. "Mr. Harrison, I wasn't expecting you." His face lit up. "Lisa, I hope you don't mind the intrusion." I was driving back from my own family gathering and realized I'd be passing right by Riverside. I had some documents that couldn't wait until our meeting tomorrow, and I thought, well, why not deliver them personally? Documents. Tomorrow's meeting. The words hung in the air like breadcrumbs, leading to a truth none of them were prepared for. Mom appeared at my elbow, hostess instincts kicking in. "Won't you come in?" "I'm Carol Parker, Lisa's mother. We were just sitting down to Easter dinner." Mr. Harrison's smile widened. "How lovely." "I don't want to impose, but Lisa, if you have just a moment, these papers really are time-sensitive." I nodded, acutely aware of every eye. This wasn't how I'd imagined this moment. I'd planned to keep my two worlds separate, let my family believe whatever they needed to believe. But here was Mr. Harrison, holding a leather portfolio that probably contained more money than Ryan made in a year. Of course, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "Should we step into the kitchen?" "Actually," Mr. Harrison said, glancing around the room with the practiced assessment of a man who'd spent decades reading people. "Since this is a family celebration, and since these documents affect some significant decisions you'll need to make, perhaps your family should hear this, too." That is, if you're comfortable with that. I looked at their faces. Ryan's confusion was shifting to something almost like panic. Dad muted the TV, leaning forward. Mom's polite smile was strained. Amanda had put her phone down. They wanted to know. Oh, they wanted to know. For the first time in years, I was the center of attention, and not because I was being used as an example of what not to do. All right, I said, surprising myself. Yes, they can hear it. Mr. Harrison nodded, approvingly. He opened his portfolio. Excellent. Well, then, Lisa, I'm pleased to inform you that the quarterly dividends from your shares in Harrison Industries have exceeded our projections by 18%. Your total return for this quarter alone is $2.4 million. The silence was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from 3 rooms away. $2.4 million. This quarter alone, Ryan's face had gone completely pale. Mom's hand flew to her chest. Dad's recliner creaked as he sat up straighter than I'd seen him in years. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison continued, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather, the board met last week to discuss the expansion into the Southeast markets. And as our third largest shareholder, your approval is needed for the final phase of the acquisition. I have the contracts here for your review. Third largest shareholder, the words echoed in the stillness. Mr. Harrison looked around at their stunned faces and chuckled softly. I do hope I haven't said too much. Lisa, you did mention that you prefer to keep your business affairs private, but I assumed your family knew about your involvement with the company. I met his eyes and saw the twinkle there. The subtle amusement of a man who could read a family dynamic in 30 seconds. He knew exactly what he'd done. This wasn't an accident. This was a gift. Thank you, Mr. Harrison, I said, finding my voice again. I'll review everything tonight and have my decision to you by tomorrow afternoon. Wonderful. And please do consider my offer about joining the board officially. Your instincts for market timing have been invaluable, and frankly, we could use more voices like yours in our strategic planning meetings. He closed the portfolio and handed it to me. The weight of it felt solid and real in my hands. Now, I'll leave you to your family celebration. It smells absolutely divine in here, Mrs. Parker. You're a lucky family to have such a wonderful cook. Mom managed a strangled, thank you, but her eyes never left my face. Mr. Harrison moved to the door, then paused. Oh, and Lisa. The Riverside Community Foundation called about your anonymous donation to the new children's library. They're hoping to announce the major benefactor at the groundbreaking ceremony next month. I told them I'd pass along their request. Anonymous donation. Children's library, the hits just kept coming. After he left, the silence stretched until it became unbearable. I could feel their stares, their confusion, their desperate need to understand how their underachieving daughter had just been revealed as someone they didn't recognize at all. Ryan was the first to find his voice. What the hell just happened? I looked at him, at all of them. These people who'd spent years treating me like their charity case, their cautionary tale, their reminder of what happened when you didn't dream big enough. I guess, I said quietly, we need to talk. The aftermath felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Everyone remained frozen, as if moving might shatter whatever fragile reality we were all trying to process. The ham was getting cold, but nobody cared about Easter dinner anymore. Ryan's face cycled through shades of red, then settled on a sickly pale green. He kept opening his mouth, then closing it. For someone who made his living talking, he'd completely lost the ability to form a sentence. Dad broke the silence, his voice uncertain. Lisa, honey, what did that man just say? Did he say $2 million? $2.4 million, Amanda whispered, her phone forgotten. He said $2.4 million this quarter. Mom sank into the nearest chair, hands pressed to her chest. I don't understand. Lisa, sweetheart, what company? What shares? When did this happen? I stood there, holding Mr. Harrison's leather portfolio. The weight of it in my hands, the weight of their stares on my shoulders. This moment had been inevitable, I supposed. I'd been living 2 separate lives for so long, they were bound to collide. I just hadn't expected it to happen over Easter dinner, with my entire family as witnesses. It's a long story, I said finally, my voice sounding strange in the quiet room. We've got time, Ryan managed, his voice cracking. We've got all the time in the world. I looked at each of their faces. Curiosity, confusion, but also something else, something that looked almost like fear. The comfortable dynamic they'd all settled into, where I was the family disappointment and Ryan was the golden child, had just been completely upended. They were looking at me like I was a stranger wearing a familiar face. I walked to the couch and sat down, still clutching the portfolio. It started about 5 years ago, I began, my voice growing steadier as I found my footing in the truth. I was still working at the insurance company, but I'd been investing on the side. Small amounts at first, just whatever I could spare. Investing in what? Dad asked, leaning forward. Tech stocks initially, then some real estate. I'd always been good with numbers, good at seeing patterns. You remember how I used to balance Mom's checkbook in high school? Spotting bank errors? Mom nodded slowly, a distant look in her eyes as she recalled those evenings. Well, I applied that same analytical thinking to the stock market. I started small, researching companies, studying financial reports, tracking trends. I wasn't trying to get rich quick. I was just trying to build something stable for my future. Ryan's voice was barely audible. How much did you start with? $300, I said, watching his expression shift from disbelief to something approaching nausea. My tax refund from that year. I put it into a tech startup developing software for small businesses. The company was called Harrison Industries. Harrison? Amanda repeated. Like the man who was just here. His grandson founded the company. James Harrison was 24, fresh out of MIT, with an idea for streamlining inventory management. Nobody thought much of it. The big investment firms weren't interested. But I saw something they didn't. I paused, remembering those early days, researching from my tiny studio apartment, living on ramen and determination. It felt like a lifetime ago, and also like yesterday. I saw that every small business owner I'd ever met struggled with the same problems. They couldn't afford the big enterprise software. James's software was simple, affordable, and it actually worked. So, I bought 10 shares. 10 shares? Dad echoed. For $300, $30 a share, I confirmed. 6 months later, Harrison Industries landed their first major contract with a restaurant chain. The stock jumped to $60 a share. I could have sold and doubled my money, but I didn't. Why not? Mom asked, genuinely curious now. Because I'd done more research. I could see they were just getting started. The restaurant chain was talking about expanding. Other businesses were starting to pay attention. So instead of selling, I bought more shares. I looked around the room, seeing the beginning of understanding dawn on their faces. This wasn't about getting lucky once. This was about calculated decisions over years, about seeing opportunities others missed, about the patience to let those decisions compound. Every time I got a bonus at work, every time I had a little extra money, I put it into Harrison Industries. Not because I was gambling, but because I understood their business model better than most investors. I knew their target market because I'd worked with small business owners through the insurance company. I understood their challenges, and I could see how Harrison's solutions addressed real problems. Ryan's face was a mixture of confusion and something that might have been admiration. How many shares do you own now? I opened the portfolio and glanced at the top document, though I knew the numbers by heart. 873,000 shares. The silence that followed was different. This wasn't the silence of shock anymore. This was the silence of people trying to do math in their heads, trying to comprehend numbers too large to grasp. Amanda's voice was barely a whisper. As of market close on Friday, about $67 million. Mom made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a laugh. Dad's recliner creaked as he sat back heavily. Ryan looked like he might be sick. But that's not the whole story, I continued, feeling oddly liberated by finally sharing this part of my life. About 3 years ago, James Harrison approached me directly. The company was growing faster than anticipated, and they needed capital for expansion. But more than that, they needed investors who understood their vision. He approached you personally? Mom asked. My investment history spoke for itself. I'd been buying their stock consistently for 2 years, through ups and downs. Never panic selling when the market dipped, never getting greedy when it surged. That kind of pattern tells a story about an investor's character and confidence in the company. I thought back to that first meeting with James Harrison, how nervous I'd been in his sleek downtown office, still in my insurance blazer, clutching my research notes. He'd offered me a significant stake at a preferential rate, but only if I was willing to take an active role in strategic decisions. He said they needed investors who understood the market from the ground up, not just spreadsheets. "So, you quit your job?" Dad asked. "Not right away. I started as a consultant, working evenings and weekends, helping them identify new market opportunities and partnerships. The insurance company actually became one of their first enterprise clients after I showed my boss how Harrison's software could streamline our claims processing." I smiled, remembering how surreal it felt to be in a meeting where I was simultaneously the employee suggesting the vendor and a part owner of that vendor. "When did you quit?" Ryan's voice was strange, like he was asking about someone else's life. "Last year. James offered me a position on the board of directors, and the quarterly dividends for my shares were already more than my annual salary at the insurance company. It seemed like the right time." "What do you do now?" Amanda asked. "I mean, day-to-day? I evaluate potential acquisitions for Harrison Industries. We're expanding into new markets, buying smaller companies that complement our core business. I spend a lot of time traveling, meeting with business owners, analyzing financials, negotiating deals. It's not glamorous work, but it's work I'm good at." I could see them trying to reconcile this version of me with the quiet, unremarkable daughter they thought they knew. The woman who traveled for business, sat on corporate boards, made decisions involving millions. She didn't fit with their image of Lisa, who couldn't afford weekend trips to the city. "The apartment downtown?" Mom said slowly. "You said you were renting." "I never said I was renting." "You assumed I was renting." I felt a small stab of guilt, but it was true. I'd never lied directly. I just never corrected their assumptions. "I bought the building 3 years ago. The penthouse is mine. I rent out the other units." "The building?" Ryan repeated, flatly. "You own the building?" "It's a good investment property. Downtown Riverside is gentrifying faster than most people realize. Property values have increased 30% since I bought it." Dad was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to clear water from his ears. "Lisa, honey, why didn't you tell us? All this time you thought I was the family failure," I finished gently. "You thought I was too scared to take risks, too content with mediocrity, too lacking in ambition to achieve anything meaningful." The words hung in the air, not accusatory, but factual. We all knew it was true. "That's not," Mom started, then stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence honestly. "It's okay," I said, and realized I meant it. "I let you think that because it was easier than constantly defending my choices. When I drove my Honda instead of leasing a BMW, you saw evidence I couldn't afford better. I saw it as not wanting to waste money on status symbols. When I chose quiet dinners at home over expensive restaurants, you saw limitation. I saw preference." I looked directly at Ryan, whose face had gone through another color change. "When you talked about my lack of career prospects, I didn't correct you because I didn't need your validation. I knew what I was building. I knew what I was worth. Your opinion of my success didn't change the reality of my bank account." "But why keep it secret?" Amanda asked. "Why let us think you were struggling?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times. The answer was complicated, layered with years of family dynamics. "Because I'd spent my whole life watching this family equate worth with wealth," I said carefully. "I watched Ryan's achievements get celebrated because they were visible and loud, while accomplishments that were quieter got overlooked or dismissed. I didn't want my relationship with any of you to change because of money. But it has changed anyway," Ryan said quietly. "It's changing right now." He was right. The moment Mr. Harrison walked through the door, everything had shifted. The balance of power, the family hierarchy, the assumptions we'd all lived with. It was all different now. I also didn't want to become the family bank, I admitted. I've watched what happens in families where one person has significantly more money than the others. Suddenly, every conversation becomes about loans and investments and expectations. I wanted to avoid that dynamic. Mom's face crumpled slightly. Did you think we'd only love you for your money? No, I said quickly, that wasn't quite right. But I thought the money might change how you saw me. And I liked being loved for who I was, even if who you thought I was wasn't entirely accurate. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to preserve their love, I'd accepted their pity. In trying to avoid being valued for my wealth, I'd allowed myself to be devalued for my perceived lack of it. Besides, I added, I wasn't ready to handle your reactions, Ryan. You've spent years using my supposed financial struggles as a measuring stick for your own success. Dad, you've given countless speeches about risk-taking and ambition while using me as an example of what happens when someone plays it too safe. Mom, you've worried about me and tried to protect me from a reality that didn't actually exist. I gestured around the room. This reaction right here? This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. The shock, the confusion, the need to completely recalibrate how you see me and yourselves. It's exhausting for everyone involved. So, you were just going to keep pretending forever? Ryan asked, and there was something raw in his voice I hadn't heard before. I don't know, I answered. Honestly, I hadn't really thought about forever. I was just taking it one family gathering at a time. It became a habit, I suppose. The longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine changing it. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Something had been shifting in me. A growing exhaustion with the pretense, a desire to be fully known. Maybe Mr. Harrison's visit wasn't as accidental as it seemed. Maybe some part of me wanted this moment to happen. What happens now? Mom asked, her voice small and uncertain. It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. How do you rebuild family relationships on a foundation of truth after years of carefully maintained fiction? I don't know, I said again, the only honest answer I had. I suppose we figure it out together. Ryan stood abruptly, running his hands through his hair. I need some air, he said, and walked out the back door into Mom's garden. I watched him pace among the Easter lilies, phone pressed to his ear. Probably calling his girlfriend, or maybe his business partner, trying to process this new reality where his underachieving sister was actually more successful than he'd ever dreamed. He's hurt, Mom said softly, following my gaze. I know, I replied. I'm sorry about that. Are you? Dad asked. No judgment, just curiosity. I thought about it honestly. I'm sorry he's hurt. I'm not sorry I kept it private. Those are two different things. Amanda had picked up her phone again, staring at the blank screen. I told everyone at work that my cousin was struggling financially, she said suddenly. I used you as an example when we were talking about career planning. I said you were what happened when someone didn't set clear goals. The admission hung between us, awkward and painful, but necessary, like lancing a wound. I know, I said gently. I heard about it through mutual friends. It's okay, Amanda. You didn't know. But I should have known, she insisted. We're family. I should have asked more questions, paid more attention. I should have wondered why someone as smart as you was supposedly stuck in a dead-end job. It was a fair point, speaking to larger issues of how we'd all related to each other. We'd gotten into the habit of making assumptions rather than asking questions. We all made assumptions, I said. I let you make them, which makes me complicit. Mom was looking at me with an unreadable expression. What about the foundation donation? Mr. Harrison mentioned the children's library. Heat rose in my cheeks. This was the most personal part of my financial life. Riverside's library system is underfunded, I said simply. The children's section especially. They've been trying to build a new branch on the east side for years, but could never raise enough money. So, I helped. How much? Dad asked. Enough to fund the entire project, $2.8 million. The number echoed. Nearly $3 million, donated anonymously, to build a library for children in the town where I'd grown up, where I'd spent countless hours losing myself in books because they offered an escape from suffocating family dynamics. That's why you wanted to stay anonymous, Mom said, understanding dawning. You knew if people found out Lisa Parker had donated that much money, word would get back to us. Partly, I admitted. But also, the donation wasn't about recognition. It was about the library. I wanted the focus to be on the building and the programs it would fund, not on who paid for it. We sat in relative quiet for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Outside, Ryan had finished his call and was sitting on the garden bench, staring at Mom's rose bushes as if they held answers. The Easter ham was definitely cold by now, the side dishes congealing, but none of us were hungry anymore. This conversation was too important to interrupt for food. I have questions, Dad said finally. I figured you would. But I don't know how to ask them without sounding like I'm interrogating you, or like I'm trying to figure out what this means for us financially. His honesty was refreshing and painful. Ask whatever you want to ask, Dad. We're past polite avoidance now. He was quiet, gathering his thoughts. Are you happy? He asked finally. With your life, with your work, with your choices? Not the money part, but the rest of it. It wasn't the question I'd expected, but it was maybe the most important one. Yes, I said, and realized how true it was. I'm happier than I've been in years. The work is challenging and meaningful. I'm good at it, and I can see the impact it has on the businesses we acquire and the communities they serve. I wake up excited about projects, go to sleep feeling like I've contributed something valuable. That's what matters, Mom said softly. That's what we always wanted for both of you kids. But even as she said it, I could see the questions in her eyes. The doubt about whether that was really what they'd wanted, or whether they'd gotten so caught up in external markers they'd lost sight of what truly mattered. The back door opened and Ryan came inside. His face composed, but his eyes red-rimmed. He sat heavily on the couch across from me, his usual swagger completely absent. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. Actually, I owe you about 1,000 apologies, but I'll start with one. I waited, letting him find his words. I've been an ass, he continued. For years, I've been using you as my measuring stick, making myself feel better about my own insecurities by putting you down. I told myself it was just sibling rivalry, harmless teasing, but it wasn't. It was cruel and it was constant, and you didn't deserve it. His voice cracked slightly. The worst part is, I think some part of me knew I was wrong about you. You were always too smart, too composed, too competent for someone who was actually struggling. But I didn't want to look too closely because then I'd have to admit that my whole sense of superiority was built on a lie. It was more self-awareness than I'd ever heard from Ryan. More honesty than he'd shown in years. I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. Thank you, I said simply. That means a lot. I don't know how to be your brother now, he admitted. I don't know how to relate to you when everything I thought I knew was wrong. You start by being honest, I suggested. About who you are, what you want, what scares you. And you ask me to do the same. We figure out who we actually are to each other, not who we've been pretending to be. He nodded slowly, absorbing the idea. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think less of me now? Now that you know I've been bragging about achievements that don't even come close to what you've accomplished? It was a vulnerable question, asked without bravado. For the first time in years, I was seeing my brother as he actually was, not as the character he played. I think you're good at sales. You work hard and you've built a solid career, I said carefully. I think you're also insecure about your worth, in ways that make you competitive about things that don't matter. But that's not unique to you, Ryan. Most people struggle with those feelings. But you don't. I struggle with different things. I struggle with letting people see who I really am. I struggle with asking for help when I need it. I struggle with accepting that I deserve love even when I'm not being useful or productive. I paused. Success doesn't solve personality flaws, Ryan. It just gives you different problems to work through. Amanda had been uncharacteristically quiet during Ryan's apology, but now she spoke up. This is going to sound selfish, but I need to know something. Have you been laughing at us this whole time? When we talk about money problems or career stress, have you been secretly thinking about how naive we are? No, I said immediately, because that concern I could address directly. Never. Your problems are real, even if they're different from mine. Financial stress doesn't become less valid because someone else has more money. Career anxiety doesn't disappear because someone else has a different kind of job. But surely you must think we're small-minded, she pressed, worried about things that seem insignificant from your perspective. I thought about how to answer honestly. I think we all have a tendency to assume our problems are the most important problems, and that everyone else's struggles are less real than our own. But I've never thought your concerns were silly or unimportant. Different, yes, but not less valid. The conversation was interrupted by Mom's phone. She glanced at the screen. It's your Aunt Carol, probably wondering where we are with dinner. She's supposed to stop by for dessert. The reminder of the outside world, of normal Easter traditions, felt jarring after the intensity of the past hour. How do you go back to small talk about weather and work gossip when you've just fundamentally altered the foundation of your family relationships? What do we tell people? Mom asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Whatever you want to tell them, I said. This is your information now, too. You can share it or keep it private. Whatever feels right to you. But what do you want? Dad asked. I want you to be comfortable, I said honestly. I want you to be able to talk about your daughter's life without having to maintain a fiction. But I also don't want my financial situation to become the primary topic of conversation at every family gathering for the next decade. Ryan laughed, a short, sharp sound. I think that ship has sailed, Lisa. This is going to be the topic of conversation for a very long time. He was probably right. The revelation was too big, too shocking, too contrary to everything they'd believed about me to be absorbed quickly. There would be months of processing, of questions, of adjustments. There's something else, I said, knowing I needed to address it before we moved on. Mr. Harrison mentioned that Harrison Industries is considering me for an official board position. If I accept it, it would mean more travel, more public visibility, more opportunities for people to connect me to the company's success. Would you want that? Mom asked. I think so. The work would be challenging, and I'd have more influence over the company's direction. But it would also make it much harder to maintain privacy about my financial situation. Maybe it's time to stop trying to maintain that privacy, Dad suggested gently. I looked around the room at these people who'd known me my whole life, but were just now meeting me for the first time. They were right, of course. The elaborate fiction I'd maintained was exhausting and unsustainable. But letting go felt like stepping off a cliff, not knowing what kind of landing waited below. Maybe it is, I agreed. The decision to have Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob join us for dessert felt surreal. Mom insisted that canceling would raise more questions than we were ready to answer. So, we reheated Easter dinner, pretending nothing earth-shattering had occurred. I watched Mom bustle, her movements more frantic, glancing at me like she was checking to make sure I was real. Should I put the good china away? She asked, gesturing to the formal settings. I mean, if we're just having dessert, Mom, I said gently. It's fine. Use whatever dishes you want. Aunt Carol isn't going to notice if we eat pie off paper plates or wedding china. But I knew the question wasn't about dishes. It was about normal. She was grasping for some semblance of the predictable Easter she'd planned. Ryan had disappeared upstairs, claiming he needed to change his shirt. I suspected he was trying to gather himself. Dad was in his study, ostensibly checking email, but actually hiding from the emotional complexity. Amanda offered to help, but mostly she was asking questions that had been building since Mr. Harrison left. Not the big questions about money, but smaller, more personal inquiries. Do you have an office? She asked while folding napkins. I mean, like a real office, with a secretary and everything? I have office space in the Harrison Industries building downtown, I replied, arranging glasses. But I don't have a traditional secretary. I have an assistant who helps coordinate my travel and manages my calendar. She works with several board members. What does your office look like? I thought about the corner suite on the 15th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's cars. It's nice, I said simply. Professional, good natural light. That's it? That's all you're going to tell me? I smiled despite the tension. It has a conference table for 6, a desk that's probably too big for the space, and a view of the water. The walls are gray, and there's artwork from local artists. Is there something specific you want to know? I want to know what it feels like, she said, her voice more serious than I expected. What it feels like to walk into a building where you own part of the company, where people call you Ms. Parker and mean it respectfully, where your opinion actually matters in rooms full of important people. The question caught me off guard with its perceptiveness. Amanda had always seemed focused on surface details, but this was deeper. It feels surreal sometimes, I admitted, like I'm playing a role that doesn't quite fit yet. But it also feels right, like I'm finally using skills I'd been developing for years without realizing it. The opinions I'd formed about businesses and markets turned out to be valuable to people who make decisions about millions of dollars. Do you ever feel like an imposter? Every day, I said honestly. Especially in the beginning. I'd sit in board meetings with people who had Harvard MBAs and decades of experience, and I'd wonder what I was doing there. But then I'd see something they missed, or I'd ask a question that changed how we approached a problem, and I'd remember that I earned my seat at that table. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. I realized she was asking these questions not just out of curiosity, but because she was trying to understand something about ambition and success that she'd never had to consider. Ryan's path had always been the template for achievement. My path was different, quieter, more strategic. I'd built wealth through patience and analysis, gained influence through competence. A model that didn't fit their conventional narrative. The doorbell rang, Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob. My stomach tightened. How do you act normal when your whole financial situation has been revealed as a fiction? I'll get it, Mom called, smoothing her hair. She paused, looking back at me, a mix of question and plea. We don't have to tell them anything today, I said quietly. This can stay between us until you're ready to share it. She nodded gratefully and opened the door. Aunt Carol's bright smile, Uncle Bob's familiar wave. They bustled in, carrying leftovers, talking over each other about traffic, weather, new landscaping. Lisa! Aunt Carol exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that smelled like her signature perfume and Easter lilies. You look wonderful, honey. That color is perfect on you. I was wearing a simple blue sweater. It wasn't expensive or fashionable, but Aunt Carol's compliment felt loaded with new meaning. Was she really commenting on my appearance, or unconsciously responding to some change in my demeanor? Some confidence from finally telling the truth? Thank you, I said, accepting her hug. How was your dinner? Did Cousin Michael make it home from college? As they launched into updates, I studied their faces, wondering how they'd react to the news. Would they be proud? Or feel deceived? Would they ask for investment advice? Or worse, for loans? Where's Ryan? Aunt Carol asked. I wanted to hear about his latest business triumph. He's upstairs changing, Mom said quickly. He'll be down in a minute. But when Ryan appeared, he looked like a different person. His usual swagger gone, replaced by a quieter, more uncertain energy. Hey, Aunt Carol, Uncle Bob, he said, accepting their hugs with less enthusiasm. You look tired, sweetheart, Aunt Carol said, studying his face. Are you working too hard? Something like that, Ryan replied, avoiding my eyes. The conversation over dessert felt strained, full of undercurrents Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob couldn't identify, but clearly sensed. Mom's responses were distracted. Dad was quiet. Ryan actively avoided work topics. I found myself overcompensating, asking detailed questions about their retirement plans. Anything to fill the awkward silences. You're awfully chatty today, Lisa, Uncle Bob observed with a smile. Usually, you're a quiet observer. It's nice to hear more from you. The comment made me realize how dramatically my behavior had shifted. For years, I'd been content to fade into the background. But something about finally telling the truth had freed me to engage more actively. I guess I'm feeling more social today, I said, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. After Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob left, the five of us were back in the living room. The immediate shock of Mr. Harrison's visit had worn off, replaced by a more complex set of emotions. I have a confession, Mom said, settling into her favorite chair. I called your Aunt Susan while you were all getting dessert ready. The admission hung in the air like a grenade. Aunt Susan was the family's unofficial communication hub. Mom! Ryan said, his voice tight with panic and resignation. I didn't tell her about the money, Mom said quickly. I just told her that we'd learned some things about Lisa's work situation that we hadn't known before, and that we were all very proud of her. What did she say? I asked, guessing already. She said she always knew you had it in you, and that she'd never understood why we were so worried about your future. Mom's smile was knowing. Apparently, we were the only ones who thought you were struggling. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I'd been so focused on my immediate family's perceptions that I hadn't considered how my choices might look to more distant relatives. Aunt Susan always liked you, Dad said thoughtfully. She used to say you reminded her of herself at that age. Quiet but determined, watching everything, planning ahead. She never said that to me, I replied. She said it to us. Usually, when we were worrying about your career prospects or your social life, she'd tell us to stop fussing, that you knew what you were doing, even if we couldn't see it. I felt an unexpected surge of affection for Aunt Susan. The idea that she'd been defending my choices was both touching and embarrassing. What else did she say? Amanda asked. She asked if this meant you'd finally start dating someone appropriate, Mom said with a slight smile. Apparently, she's been worried that you were limiting your options because you thought you couldn't afford to date men with expensive tastes. The comment made me laugh genuinely. Aunt Susan has been worried about my dating life? She thinks you're too practical for your own good, Mom explained. She's convinced that you've been avoiding relationships because you didn't want to be a financial burden on anyone. It was a theory both completely wrong and strangely insightful. I hadn't been avoiding relationships because of money, but because I was tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Dating while maintaining an elaborate financial fiction was exhausting and dishonest. For what it's worth, I said, I haven't been avoiding relationships because of practical concerns. I've been avoiding them because I wasn't ready to let someone see who I really am. And now? Dad asked. Now, I guess I'll have to figure that out along with everything else. The conversation was interrupted by my phone. A text from James Harrison. Asterisk, hope your family Easter went well. Mr. H mentioned he stopped by with documents. Call me tomorrow if you need anything clarified. Also, Sarah from the foundation called about the library announcement. They're hoping for a response by Wednesday. Asterisk, I stared at the message, realizing my carefully compartmentalized life was merging in ways I hadn't anticipated. James Harrison texting me about family dinner. The foundation wanting to publicize my donation. My two worlds weren't just colliding, they were becoming one. Everything okay? Ryan asked, noticing my expression. James Harrison, texting about the documents his grandfather brought over, I said. And about the library donation. They want to make an announcement. What will you tell them? Mom asked. I'm not sure yet. I need to think about what I'm ready for in terms of public attention. But even as I said it, I knew the decision had been made for me. Mr. Harrison's visit had started a process that couldn't be reversed. My family knew the truth, which meant eventually other people would know. The fiction was unraveling. I could either try to control it, or let it happen organically. Can I ask you something? Ryan said, his voice more tentative than I'd heard it all day. Of course. When you were building all this, when you were making these investments and building relationships with people like James Harrison, were you ever tempted to tell us? Were there moments when you wanted to share it? It was a vulnerable question, asked without defensiveness or resentment. He genuinely wanted to understand my thought process, my emotional experience. There were moments, I admitted, especially when you were celebrating your achievements. I sometimes wanted to share mine, too. But then I'd remember how competitive things got between us, how everything became a comparison, and I'd decide to keep quiet. I made it competitive, Ryan said. That was my doing, not yours. We both participated in it. I just chose to compete silently instead of openly. He nodded, absorbing that. I think I understand now why you kept it secret. I don't like it, but I understand it. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it. I'm sorry I let you think I was failing when I was actually succeeding. I'm sorry I let you use me as a measuring stick for your own worth. And I'm sorry I created an environment where honesty felt risky, he replied. I'm sorry I made my own insecurity your problem to manage. The apology felt significant, like the beginning of a different kind of relationship. What happens now? Amanda asked, echoing the question that hovered over all of us. Carefully, I said honestly. With patience for the fact that it's going to take time to adjust to a new normal. Will you take the board position? Dad asked. Probably. The work interests me, and I think I can contribute something valuable. But I'll need to discuss the implications with all of you first. More public visibility means less privacy for the whole family, not just for me. We can handle that, Mom said firmly. We can handle people knowing that our daughter is successful. That's not a burden, Lisa. That's a gift. Her words settled something inside me. For years, I'd convinced myself my success might be a burden. But looking at their faces now, I could see the burden had been the secrecy, not the success itself. There's something else we need to talk about, I said, knowing we couldn't avoid it. The practical implications. I need you all to know that my financial situation doesn't create any obligations for any of you, and it doesn't give me any special authority over family decisions. I'm still just Lisa, your daughter and sister. The money doesn't change that. But it does change some things, Uncle Bob had said earlier, and he was right. Money always changed things. Yes, I agreed. It changes some things. It means I can afford to help if someone has a genuine emergency. It means I might be able to contribute to family celebrations in different ways. It means I'll need to be thoughtful about how my choices affect all of you, especially if I take a more public role. And it means, Ryan added quietly, that I need to figure out who I am when I'm not the successful Parker child. You're still successful, I said firmly. You've built a good career. You work hard. You contribute value. None of that changes because I've been successful, too. But it does change how I think about success, he said. It changes what I think matters and what I think I need to prove. He was right. The revelation would force all of us to reconsider our definitions of achievement. I think, Mom said thoughtfully, that this is going to be good for all of us. Difficult, but good. We've been operating on assumptions for too long. It's time we started dealing with reality. As the afternoon stretched into evening, as we cleaned up and returned the house to its normal state, I felt something I hadn't felt in years during family gatherings. I felt seen. Not completely understood, not perfectly accepted, but genuinely seen for who I actually was. It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation of movies, no tearful declarations that erased years of misunderstanding. But there was something more valuable, the beginning of honest relationships based on truth rather than fiction. When I finally left for my apartment that evening, carrying leftover ham and a slice of Uncle Bob's coconut cake, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of maintaining two separate identities was gone, replaced by the simpler challenge of figuring out how to be fully myself with people who were still learning who that person was. The drive home through familiar riverside streets felt different, like I was seeing the town through new eyes. This was where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to hide parts of myself, where I'd built a fortune while pretending to struggle. But it was also where I'd learned to analyze and plan, where I'd developed the skills that made my success possible, where I'd chosen to invest in a library because I remembered what those books had meant to a lonely kid who felt invisible in her own family. Tomorrow, I would call James Harrison and accept the board position. I would call the foundation and agree to the library announcement. I would begin the process of living publicly as the person I'd been privately for years. But tonight, I would sit in my penthouse apartment overlooking the river, eating leftover Easter dinner, reviewing contracts, planning acquisitions that would affect thousands of jobs. Tonight, for the first time in years, those two versions of myself didn't feel like contradictions. They felt like the same person, finally allowed to exist in the same space. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crisp spring air that made Riverside feel full of possibility. I stood at my office window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up. The familiar routine looked different now that I was no longer hiding. Every person hurrying to work, every business opening its doors, every decision made in conference rooms, it all felt connected to my story. My assistant, Maria, knocked and entered with her usual efficiency. "Good morning, Lisa. James Harrison called about 20 minutes ago. He wanted to confirm your availability for the emergency board meeting this afternoon. Apparently, there's been a development with the Peterson Industries acquisition. Peterson Industries, that family-owned manufacturing company in Toledo we'd been courting for 6 months. Their CEO, Frank Peterson, had been resistant to selling despite mounting debt and his approaching retirement. What kind of development? I asked, settling behind my desk. He didn't provide details, but he sounded pleased, almost excited, which you know isn't typical for James when it comes to difficult acquisitions. She was right. James was methodical, cautious. If he was pleased, something significant had changed. Can you confirm my attendance and ask for any background materials? Already done. The meeting's at 2:30 in the main conference room. James is having lunch with Mr. Peterson, Sr., at noon, so we should have more information by then. After Maria left, I thought about the timing. Just 2 days after my family learned about my success, I was walking into what could be one of Harrison Industries' most significant acquisitions. The symmetry felt almost too convenient, like the universe conspiring to prove my secret life had been real. My phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. *, can I take you to lunch today? I have some things I want to discuss. *, the message surprised me. Since Easter, we'd exchanged brief texts, but nothing substantial. I'd assumed he needed more time. I texted back, *, I'm free until 1:30. Want to meet at Riverside Cafe? *, perfect. See you at noon. *, the cafe was a local institution. Excellent sandwiches and soup, a mix of professionals and longtime residents, a place for serious conversations without feeling too formal. Ryan was already there, staring into his coffee. He looked up as I approached, his expression devoid of the usual confident mask. Thanks for meeting me, he said, standing to give me a brief hug. I know your schedule is probably more complicated than I realized. I sat down. My schedule is manageable. What's on your mind? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everything. Nothing. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Sunday, and I keep coming back to the same question: how do I fix this? Fix what? Us? Our relationship? The way I've treated you for years? He leaned forward, hands wrapped around his mug. I've been going over conversations we've had. Things I've said about your life, your choices, your future, and I'm horrified, Lisa. I'm genuinely horrified by how cruel I've been. Ryan, no. Let me finish. I need to say this. He took a deep breath. I called Jenny yesterday and told her about what happened at Easter dinner. Not the money stuff, just that I'd learned some things about my sister that made me realize I'd been a terrible brother. And you know what she said? I waited. She said she wasn't surprised. She said she'd been wondering for months why I always talked about you like you were some kind of cautionary tale when you seemed like one of the most together people she'd ever met. He shook his head. My own girlfriend could see what I couldn't. She could see that you were successful and confident and happy while I was busy convincing myself that you were struggling so I could feel better about my own insecurities. The admission was raw, honest. I could see how much it was costing him, not just in wounded pride, but in forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character. What did Jenny say when you told her the whole story? That she wanted to meet you properly. That she'd always felt like I was keeping her at arm's length from my family, and now she understands why. I was too ashamed of how I treated you to let her get close enough to see it clearly. Our server appeared to take our orders, giving us a moment to regroup. When she left, Ryan continued. I've been thinking about why I did it, why I needed to believe you were failing in order to feel good about my own success. And I think it goes back to when we were kids. How so? You were always smarter than me, always more focused, more disciplined, more naturally good at things that mattered. In school, you got better grades without seeming to try as hard. You understood math concepts I had to struggle with. You read books I couldn't get through. I'd never thought about our childhood dynamic in those terms, but I could see how he might have experienced it. When we got older and I found sales, I finally had something I was good at, something that got me praise and recognition and financial rewards. For the first time, I felt like I was winning. You are good at sales because you're naturally good with people, I said. That's a genuine skill, Ryan. It's not something I could do well. Maybe not. But when you didn't immediately follow the same path I did, when you took a quieter approach to your career, I convinced myself it was because you couldn't compete. I told myself you were playing it safe because you weren't brave or ambitious enough to take real risks. He paused as our sandwiches arrived, neither of us touching our food. The truth is, I was terrified that you were going to surpass me again, that you were going to find some quiet, brilliant way to be more successful than I was, and I'd go back to being the Parker child who wasn't quite as smart, wasn't quite as capable. So, I kept putting you down, kept reinforcing the narrative that you were the one who hadn't lived up to your potential. But I did surpass you, I said gently, by every external measure of success that you value. I've been more financially successful than you for years, and the world didn't end. I know that now, but knowing it intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things. He finally took a bite of his sandwich. I called my therapist this morning. The statement surprised me. I hadn't known he was in therapy. I've been seeing Dr. Martinez for about 6 months. Jenny suggested it when I was going through a rough patch at work last fall. She said I seemed angry all the time and that I was taking it out on people who didn't deserve it. It's helping, more than I expected, especially now. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my need to compete with you wasn't really about you at all. It was about my own fear of not being enough, not mattering, not having value beyond my achievements. He looked directly at me. I want to be a better brother to you, Lisa. I want to have a relationship that isn't built on competition or comparison, or me needing to feel superior, but I don't know how to do that yet. You start by having conversations like this one, I suggested. You start by being honest about your feelings instead of expressing them through criticism or condescension. You start by asking questions about my life because you're genuinely interested, not because you're looking for ammunition. Can you be patient with me while I figure that out? Can you give me a chance to prove that I can change? The vulnerability in his question was so genuine that I felt defensive walls I'd built over years begin to loosen. Of course, I can. But Ryan, I need you to understand something. I don't need you to change in order to be okay. I've built a good life, a life I'm proud of, regardless of our family dynamics. I'm not waiting for your approval or your acceptance to feel good about my choices. I know. That's what makes this even more important. You don't need anything from me, which means that anything I offer has to be genuine. It has to come from a place of actually caring about you as a person, not from obligation or guilt. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the weight of the conversation. I found myself studying Ryan's face, looking for signs of the brother I'd grown up with before competition and insecurity complicated our relationship. He was still there, I realized. The boy who taught me to ride a bike, defended me from bullies, shared late-night dreams. Can I ask you something? He said eventually. Always. When you were building all this, when you were learning about business and finance, did you ever think about asking me for advice? I mean, I know I was insufferable about my own success, but I do have experience with client relationships and business development. It was a fair question. I thought about it sometimes, especially in the early days when I was trying to understand market psychology and client behavior, but I was afraid that asking for your help would give you ammunition to use against me later if things didn't work out. That's fair, and probably accurate given how I was behaving. But also, I continued, I needed to prove to myself that I could do it independently. I needed to know that my success was truly mine, not borrowed or dependent on connections through family. Do you think you would have been as successful if you'd had more support from us? If we'd been encouraging instead of dismissive? I considered the question seriously. I honestly don't know. The independence forced me to be more thorough in my research, more careful in my decision-making. It made me develop confidence in my own judgment that I might not have cultivated if I'd had a safety net of family advice and support. So, in a weird way, our dismissal of your potential actually helped you succeed. Maybe, I concluded, with a small smile. Or maybe I would have been successful either way, just along a different path. I'll never know for sure, and I'm okay with that uncertainty. My phone buzzed with a reminder about the board meeting. 1:15, I needed to head back. I have to get back to work, I said, reaching for my wallet. Let me get lunch, Ryan said quickly. It's the least I can do. Thank you. As we stood to leave, Ryan hesitated. Can I ask what you're heading back to? What does your afternoon look like? For a moment, I almost deflected with a vague answer. The old habit of protecting my professional life from family scrutiny was still strong. But then I remembered the secrecy was over. Board meeting at 2:30. We're discussing the potential acquisition of a manufacturing company in Toledo. It's been a complicated negotiation, but something changed over the weekend that has James Harrison optimistic. James Harrison, that's the grandson of the man who came to Easter dinner? Yes, he's the CEO of Harrison Industries, and he's become a good friend over the years we've worked together. Ryan nodded slowly. What's your role in the acquisition discussions? I'm responsible for evaluating the financial structure and the potential integration challenges. Manufacturing companies have different risk profiles than the tech and service businesses we usually acquire. So, my background with small business operations is relevant to the due diligence process. I could see him processing this, trying to reconcile the sister he thought he knew with the woman who evaluated multi-million-dollar acquisitions for a major corporation. That sounds like a lot of responsibility. It is, but it's also the kind of challenge I've been preparing for, whether I realized it or not, for years. We walked out of the cafe, and Ryan paused on the sidewalk. Lisa, can I say something without it sounding patronizing or strange? You can try. I'm proud of you. Not just for the money or the business success, but for the person you've become. You're confident without being arrogant, successful without being flashy, powerful without being intimidating. I hope I can learn to be more like that. The compliment caught me off guard with its sincerity. Thank you. That means more than you probably know. And I hope, he continued, that someday you'll trust me enough to share more of your professional life with me. Not because I want to take credit for your success, but because I want to understand what you're passionate about, what challenges you, what excites you about your work. I'd like that, too, I said, meaning it. Back at my office, I immersed myself in preparation for the board meeting. The Peterson Industries file was thick with financials, market analyses, correspondence dating back 6 months. Frank Peterson had built his company from a small machine shop into a regional manufacturing power. But changing markets and increased competition had strained operations that his traditional management style couldn't address. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was discussing the future of a family business on the same day I'd had my most honest conversation with Ryan in years. At 2:20, I gathered my materials and headed to the main conference room. James Harrison was already there along with the other board members and senior executives. The energy was different, more focused, anticipatory. Lisa, glad you could make it, James said, shaking my hand. I think you're going to find this development interesting. He gestured for everyone to sit. The room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of downtown Riverside, reminding me how much the city had changed, how much growth had occurred while I was quietly building my own success. As you all know, we've been pursuing Peterson Industries for months without significant progress. Frank Peterson has been resistant to discussions despite his company's obvious need for capital and strategic guidance. James opened a folder and distributed copies of a letter. This morning, I received this communication from Peterson's legal counsel. He's requesting a formal meeting to discuss terms for a potential sale. I scanned the letter, noting the urgent tone. Something had shifted dramatically. What changed? Asked Margaret Wells, our longest-serving board member. 2 things, James replied. First, Peterson's largest client, Automotive Solutions International, announced last week that they're moving their manufacturing contracts overseas. That represents about 30% of Peterson's revenue. The room was quiet. Losing a client of that magnitude would create immediate cash flow problems. Second, and more importantly, Frank Peterson received a competing acquisition offer from Meridian Capital Group. They're offering significantly below market value and planning to strip the company for parts, selling off the valuable assets and closing the manufacturing facilities. I knew Meridian's reputation. They specialized in distressed acquisitions, buying struggling companies cheaply with little regard for employees or community impact. For a man like Frank Peterson, who'd built his company as a cornerstone of Toledo's economy, selling to Meridian would be devastating. So, he's coming to us because we represent a better alternative? I asked. Exactly. We've consistently presented ourselves as interested in preserving and growing the business, rather than dismantling it. For Peterson, we're not just a buyer. We're a lifeline that allows his company to survive intact. Margaret leaned forward. What are his terms? That's what we need to discuss. He's asking for a purchase price higher than Meridian's offer, but still below our original valuation. More importantly, he wants guarantees about workforce retention and facility preservation. He wants to know that selling to us won't result in mass layoffs or plant closures. The conversation that followed was exactly the kind of strategic discussion that had drawn me to board service. We weren't just talking about financial returns. We were talking about the responsibility that came with acquiring a company that employed hundreds of people and anchored an entire community's economic stability. "What's our integration timeline?" asked David Chin, our newest board member. "That depends partly on Lisa's assessment," James said, turning to me. "You've been leading our analysis of operational compatibility and cultural fit. What's your recommendation?" I felt the familiar rush of being asked for my professional opinion on a decision that would affect thousands of lives and millions of dollars. This was why I'd accepted board membership. "Peterson's company culture is built around craftsmanship and community connection," I began, referring to my notes from site visits and employee interviews. "Their workforce is experienced and loyal, but they've been operating with outdated technology and limited capital for upgrades. The acquisition opportunity isn't just about buying their client base or their facilities. It's about investing in human capital that could drive innovation if given proper resources." I paused, looking around the table at faces that I'd learned to read. These were people who valued thoughtful analysis and long-term thinking. "My recommendation is that we proceed with the acquisition, but with a 3-year integration plan that prioritizes technology upgrades and workforce development before we attempt any operational consolidation. Peterson's employees have institutional knowledge about manufacturing processes that we can't replace easily. If we invest in training and modernization, we can probably increase productivity by 20 to 30% within 2 years." "What about the financial risk?" Margaret asked. "If the automotive industry continues shifting toward overseas manufacturing, are we buying into a declining market?" "That's the right question, but I think we're looking at market transformation rather than market decline. The companies that will succeed in the new environment are those that can offer specialized manufacturing, rapid prototyping, and customized solutions that overseas suppliers can't match. Peterson's workforce has the skills to adapt to that model if we give them the tools and training." James was nodding, and I saw approval on other faces. This was exactly the kind of strategic thinking Harrison Industries had built its reputation on. We didn't just acquire companies. We partnered with them to create sustainable growth. "Are you comfortable taking the lead on due diligence and integration planning?" James asked. "Absolutely, but I'd want to spend significant time on site in Toledo, working with Peterson's management team and key employees. Successful integration requires understanding the company culture from the inside, not just analyzing it from financial reports." "How much time are we talking about?" "Probably 2 days a week for the first 3 months, then 1 day a week for the following 6 months. It's a significant commitment, but it's necessary if we want to preserve what makes Peterson valuable while helping them adapt." The meeting continued for another hour, discussing financing structures and timelines. By the time we adjourned, I had been appointed lead coordinator for the Peterson acquisition. Walking back to my office, I felt the same professional satisfaction that had drawn me to business. This wasn't just about making money. It was about using financial resources and business expertise to solve real problems, to preserve jobs, to help a community maintain economic stability. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. *, "How was your day, sweetheart? Ryan said you two had a good lunch conversation, *, I smiled. The revelation about my financial success had created new possibilities for family connection, but also new anxieties about navigating redefined relationships. *, Day went well. Took on a new project that will keep me busy for the next few months. And yes, lunch with Ryan was good. We're figuring things out, *, I'm glad to hear that. Your father and I have been talking about everything. And we want you to know how proud we are of who you've become, *, thank you. That means everything to me, *, as I gathered my materials, I realized today marked another milestone. I'd shared details about my work with Ryan in a way that felt natural. I'd taken on professional responsibilities that would make my success more visible to the business community, and probably my family. I'd made decisions that would affect the lives of hundreds of people I'd never met. The woman who drove home to her penthouse apartment that evening was the same woman who'd sat through countless family dinners, listening to Ryan's business stories while keeping her own achievements secret. But she was also different, more complete, more willing to be seen and known for who she actually was. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, I would review acquisition documents while eating leftover Easter ham, planning strategies for preserving jobs in Toledo, sitting in an apartment overlooking the river where I'd learned to fish with my father 20 years ago. Tonight, all the pieces of my life finally felt like they belonged to the same person. 3 months later, I stood in the main assembly hall of Peterson Industries, watching Frank Peterson address his workforce for the last time as their independent owner. The acquisition had been finalized the week before. Today marked the symbolic transition. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as a desperate attempt to avoid corporate dismantling had evolved into a genuine partnership. Frank Peterson had approached the integration with methodical care. Our team had brought capital and market expertise. 32 years ago, I started this company with 12 employees and a dream of building something that would last, Frank said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall where nearly 400 workers gathered. Today, I'm proud to say the dream is continuing, just in a different form than I originally imagined. I watched the faces in the crowd, recognizing many from the weeks I'd spent on-site: Maria Santos, the quality control supervisor whose insights influenced our modernization; David Kumar, the young engineer whose ideas impressed our tech team; Janet Williams, the floor supervisor whose leadership was essential to maintaining morale. These weren't just employees being transferred. They were skilled professionals whose expertise was the foundation of Peterson's success and essential to Harrison Industries' expansion. I want to introduce you to Lisa Parker, who many of you have met, Frank continued, gesturing toward me. Lisa will be serving as our integration coordinator, working to ensure that the transition preserves what makes this company special while positioning us for future growth. The polite applause felt different now. Initially, there had been skepticism about the young woman in business attire. But over time, as workers saw I was genuinely interested in their perspectives and committed to preserving their jobs, the weariness gave way to cautious cooperation, and eventually, respect. After Frank's speech, I was surrounded by employees asking questions about healthcare benefits, equipment upgrade timelines. These conversations had become routine, but still felt significant. Each question represented someone's livelihood. Miss Parker called Tom Rodriguez, a machinist. Can you give us an update on the new CNC equipment installation? The first 2 units arrived yesterday and will be operational by next Friday, I replied. We'll be starting with a training program for the senior machinists, then expanding to the full production team over the following month. The goal is to have everyone comfortable with the new systems before we begin taking on automotive contracts that require additional precision capabilities. And the overtime situation during the training period? Asked Janet Williams. Anyone participating in the training program will receive their regular hourly rate for training time, plus overtime rates for any production work that extends beyond normal hours during the transition. We understand that learning new systems while maintaining current output levels is challenging, and we want to compensate people fairly for that extra effort. The questions continued for 20 minutes. I'd learned that transparency was essential to maintaining trust. These workers had seen other companies acquired and stripped. They needed concrete evidence of our commitment. After the formal meeting, I walked through the production areas with Frank. The facility was impressive, but I also saw areas where capital investment would yield immediate improvements. The environmental control system in Building C needs upgrading before winter, Frank noted. It's been adequate, but the new equipment will generate more heat, and worker comfort will become an issue. I made a note. I'll get estimates from 3 contractors this week. What's the timeline for installation without disrupting production schedules? If we start by mid-August, we can complete the work during the annual maintenance shutdown in September. That gives us 6 weeks to coordinate with the CNC installation and the new inventory management system rollout. The level of detail required was staggering, but it was exactly the kind of systematic problem-solving that had drawn me to business analysis. My phone buzzed. James Harrison. Lisa, hope the transition event went well, James said when I answered. I wanted to give you a heads up about something developing on the Peterson front. What kind of development? Good news, actually. The automotive contracts we've been pursuing with Peterson's enhanced capabilities are starting to materialize faster than we anticipated. General Dynamics called this morning about a specialized component manufacturing project that could represent about $15 million in annual revenue. A familiar surge of excitement mixed with the weight of responsibility. $15 million would justify the entire Peterson acquisition within 2 years. But it would also require operational expansions that needed careful management. What's the timeline? I asked. They want to start with a pilot program in October, with full production beginning in January. The question is whether Peterson's facility can handle the capacity requirements without major capital investments beyond what we've already planned. I'll need to review the specifications and talk to our production managers, but my initial sense is that we can accommodate the pilot program with current equipment and staff. Full production might require adding a second shift and some additional machinery. Can you put together a preliminary assessment by Friday? The board wants to discuss the opportunity at next week's meeting. After hanging up, I found Frank and shared the news. His reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for: excitement about growth, tempered by realistic concerns about execution. $15 million is significant, he said, but it's also the kind of rapid expansion that can strain operations if we're not careful. The good news is that our workforce has experience with automotive precision requirements. The challenging part will be scaling up without compromising quality standards. What would you need for the pilot program? Probably nothing beyond what we're already planning. For full production, we'd need to hire about 30 additional workers and invest in specialized testing equipment. The bigger question is whether we can find qualified machinists in the local labor market. A valid concern. Toledo's workforce was skilled, but unemployment was low. Let's start by assessing our current capacity and identifying the specific skill sets we'd need, I suggested. Then we can develop a recruitment strategy that builds on Peterson's reputation. The conversation was interrupted by Maria Santos, approaching with an urgent expression. Frank, Lisa, sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation with a 5 Johnson order. The client is requesting a specification change that would require retooling 3 of our main production lines. What kind of specification change? Frank asked. They want to modify the tolerance requirements for the bearing assemblies. The new specs are tighter than what we originally quoted, which means we'd need to recalibrate all the precision equipment and probably add an additional quality control step. I exchanged glances with Frank, recognizing the kind of mid-project change request that could be an opportunity or a costly disruption. What's the timeline for implementation? I asked. They want the first modified units delivered in 6 weeks. That gives us about 10 days to complete the retooling and validate the new processes before we need to begin production. And the cost implications? Roughly $30,000 in retooling costs plus about 15% more production time per unit. If we can negotiate a price adjustment with Johnson, it's manageable. If not, the project becomes marginally profitable. This illustrated why the Peterson acquisition was complex. We weren't just buying machinery. We were inheriting relationships with clients. Set up a call with Johnson's project manager for tomorrow morning, I said. We'll present them with options for implementing the specification change along with the associated cost adjustments. Frank, can you have your production team prepare detailed estimates for the retooling requirements? Absolutely, Maria. Let's schedule a planning session with the floor supervisors for later this afternoon. As Maria headed back, I realized this kind of real-time problem-solving had become the most satisfying aspect of my work. The board meetings were important, but there was something particularly rewarding about working through operational challenges that had immediate impact on workers' lives. My phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. *How's Toledo? Mom mentioned you're spending a lot of time there these days. The message made me smile. Over the past months, Ryan had genuinely tried to engage with my professional life in supportive ways. He asked thoughtful questions, offered insights, and seemed truly interested in understanding my work. I texted back, wrapping up the ownership transition today. It's been a good process overall. How are things with the Henderson account? Henderson Industries was Ryan's largest client. Landing that contract would be significant for his career. Presentation is scheduled for next Friday. Jenny helped me refine the proposal, and I think we have a strong case. Thanks for asking. The text exchange was brief, but it represented the kind of normal sibling communication that had been absent for years. We were learning to share professional updates without competition, to celebrate each other's successes without feeling diminished, to offer support without needing to demonstrate superiority. Later that afternoon, I drove back to Riverside, taking the scenic route through small towns shaped by the same economic forces affecting Peterson Industries. Manufacturing communities throughout Ohio had struggled. The Peterson acquisition represented a different approach, one that recognized the value of experienced workers and community relationships while investing in technology and market development. It wasn't a universal solution, but it showed that strategic business thinking could align with social responsibility. Arriving back in Riverside, I stopped by my parents' house for dinner, a weekly tradition that had developed organically. These Sunday evening meals had become opportunities for genuinely connecting with family members still adjusting to the reality of who I was. "How did the transition ceremony go?" Mom asked as she set plates. "Frank Peterson must be feeling emotional." "He handled it with a lot of grace," I replied, helping with dishes. "But I think he's also relieved to know that the business will continue operating as a manufacturing facility rather than being sold off for parts." "That's what matters most to people like Frank," Dad said, settling into his chair. "Building something that lasts, creating jobs that support families, contributing to the community. Money is important, but it's not the only measure of success." The comment was typical of the evolution in Dad's perspective. "Any word on the potential automotive contract James mentioned?" Ryan asked. I was still adjusting to family members asking informed questions about my projects. "Preliminary discussions are positive, but we need to complete a capacity analysis before committing. It would represent significant growth for the Toledo facility, but only if we can execute it without compromising quality or worker safety." "Sounds like the kind of challenge you're good at solving," he said, and I could hear genuine confidence in his assessment, rather than the competitive edge. The conversation continued through dinner, ranging across topics that included Amanda's new job, Dad's retirement plans, and Mom's involvement with the Library Foundation. The ease of these discussions still surprised me. Honesty about one aspect of my life had opened up possibilities for connection across all aspects of our family relationships. After dinner, Ryan and I found ourselves alone on the back porch. "Can I tell you something?" Ryan said, settling into his favorite chair from our teenage years. "Of course. I've been thinking a lot about success lately, about what it means, what it's worth, why it matters." He paused. "Before Easter, I thought success was about being better than other people, about proving that you were smarter or harder working or more deserving. And now I think it's about becoming who you're supposed to be, about using your skills and opportunities to contribute something valuable to the world. Your work with Peterson Industries isn't just about making money for Harrison Industries. It's about preserving jobs and helping a community maintain economic stability." I nodded, recognizing the shift in perspective. "My work with Henderson Industries isn't going to change the world," he continued. "But it might help them expand their operations in ways that create jobs and improve supply chain efficiency. That feels more meaningful than just trying to outsell my colleagues." "Success doesn't have to be world-changing to be meaningful," I said. "It just has to be authentic to who you are and aligned with values that matter to you." "That's what I'm learning. And I'm also learning that my success doesn't depend on your failure, and your success doesn't diminish my achievements. We can both be successful in our own ways without it being a competition." As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn where we'd played as children, I felt a deep sense of completion. The journey that had begun with Mr. Harrison's unexpected visit 3 months earlier had been dramatic and disruptive, but it had also created opportunities for honesty and connection that wouldn't have been possible while I was maintaining the fiction of my struggling circumstances. The woman who sat on that porch was the same person who had spent years quietly building a fortune, but she was also different, more complete, more willing to be known and seen and valued for who she actually was. My phone buzzed with an email from the Riverside Community Foundation. Subject: Library groundbreaking announcement. I knew tomorrow would bring another milestone. The anonymous donation phase of my philanthropy was ending, replaced by the more complex challenge of using wealth and position responsibly while maintaining the privacy and authenticity that had always been important to me. But I was ready. As Ryan and I eventually headed inside to rejoin our parents for coffee, I realized the most valuable transformation hadn't been professional or financial. It had been personal. The discovery that I could be fully myself with the people who mattered most, and that being known was better than being misunderstood, even when misunderstanding felt safer. The next morning, I would return to Toledo. I would continue building a career that aligned financial success with social responsibility. But first, I would spend another hour on the porch with my family, talking about everything and nothing, being Lisa Parker, the sister and daughter, rather than Lisa Parker, the board member and major shareholder. Being both, finally, without contradiction or apology. The woman who drove home to her penthouse apartment that night was wealthy and successful and influential. She was also content, connected, and known by the people who loved her. For the first time in years, those identities felt like they belonged to the same person, living the same integrated life.